I was 32 the first time I heard someone talk about repair as if it belonged in a marriage. My sister Ruth said it while snapping green beans in her kitchen, like she was telling me the weather. She said she and Frank had a rough argument, and then she said, "We repaired it before bed." I remember stopping with my hands in the bowl and looking at her. Repaired it. In my family, arguments ended, but they were never repaired. My father got loud, my mother got quiet, and then everybody resumed normal life with a stiff smile. By then, I had been married to Daniel for 10 years. We had 2 children, a narrow house with a loud kitchen clock, and a marriage people called steady. We did not scream, we did not throw things, we paid bills on time, we showed up for church. I thought that meant we were doing better than most people. I thought a peaceful room was the same thing as a close room. Ruth saw my face and laughed. She said, you say what happened, you say what hurt, you say what you meant, and then you stop acting like enemies." She made it sound so simple. I nearly dismissed it, but I could feel something in me react. I knew how to apologize to end tension. I knew how to swallow hurt and call myself mature. I knew how to clean the kitchen in silence when I was angry. I did not know how to come back after a sharp moment and actually feel connected again. Driving home that night with the children asleep in the back seat and the highway lights sliding over the windshield, I kept replaying her words. I started remembering all the little breaks Daniel and I had never fixed. The joke he made at my expense at a barbecue. The time I cried after Patrick was born and he called me too sensitive. The way he went silent for 2 days when I forgot our anniversary dinner because Elise had a fever. None of it looked dramatic from the outside. That was part of the problem. Our marriage was full of small cuts we treated like dust. What I believed then was that good marriages avoid damage. What I understand now is that every close life creates friction. The skill is not avoiding every bruise. The skill is knowing how to return after one. When I pulled into our driveway that night, I sat in the car for a minute with the engine off and the porch light on, feeling both hopeful and scared. If Ruth was right, then Daniel and I were missing a skill our whole marriage depended on. I carried that thought into the house like a secret and set it down beside everything else I had been pretending not to notice. I did not know it then, but this was the work that would keep us from going cold. I did not know it then, but this was the work that would keep us from going cold. I brought it up badly, which does not surprise me now. In those years, I was either silent too long or too sharp too fast. 3 nights after Ruth's kitchen conversation, Daniel came home from work tired and damp from August heat and started telling me about a filing problem at the insurance office. I was at the sink with soap up to my wrists, scraping dried potatoes from a dish, and I said, "Do we ever repair anything after we fight?" He looked at me like I had switched languages. Repair what? I could have answered plainly. I could have said, "Us? I mean us." Instead, I heard my old defensive voice come out. I said, "Exactly, you don't even know what I mean." His face changed right away. Not angry, braced. Daniel's version of bracing was always quiet. He folded the dish towel and asked, "What happened now?" That now lit me up. I started listing old hurts in no order at all. Missed birthday dinner, the joke at Jim's barbecue, the week after Patrick was born. I was not asking to be known. I was dumping receipts. He said, "You save things up and throw them at me. How am I supposed to answer all of this?" The children's cartoon was humming in the other room. The kitchen clock was clicking. He was not wrong, and that made me angrier. I told him he always wanted my feelings to be efficient. He said he was tired. I said I had been tired for years. Then he went silent and I went cold, and we finished the night in our usual way, moving around each other politely while the hurt got thicker. By midnight, I was sitting on the edge of the bed in the dark, embarrassed and furious at myself. I had finally tried to ask for something real, and I had asked for it like an accusation. I could hear Daniel in the den opening and closing drawers for no reason, the way he did when he was upset and trying not to show it. I almost let the night end there. That was our old pattern: hurt each other, sleep separately in spirit, wake up normal. But Ruth's words kept coming back. Say what happened, say what hurt, say what you meant. So I walked to the den in my nightgown and stood in the doorway. My voice shook when I said, I did this badly. I'm not trying to attack you. I'm trying to say I feel far from you after we fight and we never come back. Daniel looked at me for a long time and then said very quietly, I thought giving you space was the kind thing. That was the first honest sentence either of us had said all night. It did not fix the kitchen or the past, but it moved us out of accusation and into meaning. For the first time in our marriage, we stayed in the room after the damage instead of pretending the damage did not matter. We were terrible at repair in the beginning. Memory can make progress look graceful, but ours was not graceful. It felt like learning a dance in shoes that pinched. One of us would try to speak plainly, the other would hear blame, and we would slide right back into our old positions. I got sharper when I felt unseen. Daniel got quieter when he felt cornered. The difference was that now we noticed it while it was happening. Our first real practice came over something ordinary. Elise had a church solo one Sunday morning, and I told Daniel the night before that she was nervous and we needed to be early. At 9:15, he was still in the garage, finishing one thing. We arrived as the first hymn started. Elise sang anyway, but she sat stiff in the car afterward, looking out the window. I was angry at Daniel and ashamed for her all at once. At home, I banged dishes harder than I needed to. Daniel said, I know, which was the exact wrong sentence. Normally, I would have shut down for a day and punished him with silence. Instead, I heard myself say, Can we try something? He looked suspicious but nodded. My hands were shaking. I said, What happened is we were late after I asked you to be ready. What hurt is Elise felt alone up there, and I felt like what mattered to me didn't matter to you. What I meant last night was not that you had to be perfect. I meant I needed you with me on this. He stared at me like I had handed him a page from a manual he did not know existed. Then he said slowly, What happened is I lost track of time in the garage. What hurt is hearing you think I didn't care. I did care. I thought I had 10 more minutes. Then he looked toward the hallway and said, I should apologize to Elise. That sentence changed me more than I understood that day, not because it was poetic, because it was direct and clean. No but, no defense. He knocked on her door, and I stood by the sink, listening to the low rise and fall of his voice. I could not hear every word, but I heard enough to know he stayed with it. What I believed then was that closeness came from compatibility. If you had to work this hard, maybe something was wrong. What I understand now is that closeness often starts when two people decide to return after a miss, especially when returning feels awkward. That fall, we were not a different couple, but we were becoming a more honest one. We were learning how to come back instead of simply cooling off. Trust, I found, grows less from never hurting each other and more from seeing what happens after the hurt. I did not know it then, but this was the work that would keep us from going cold. Once I had a name for repair, I started seeing all the places I had needed it years earlier. I expected to feel vindicated. Instead, I felt grief. Learning a better way in middle age means you can suddenly see how much your younger self lived without. One winter afternoon, I was folding laundry and remembered a night after Patrick was born when he would not stop crying, and I was so exhausted I shook. Daniel stood in the doorway and said, "Tell me what to do instead of crying." I had carried that sentence for years as proof he did not care. With a repair lens, I could see the moment differently. He had asked badly, yes, but he had still reached. I needed comfort and heard criticism. He needed direction and heard rejection. Two frightened people, one colicky baby, no skill. Seeing that did not erase the loneliness of those years. It made the loneliness less personal, and that mattered. Around Christmas, he made another joke at a family dinner that put me on the spot. Everyone laughed. I smiled too tightly and waited until we were in the car to say, "That stung." He rolled his eyes and said, "Come on, it was a joke." I felt myself disappear on the spot. At home, I stood in the kitchen staring at the bread box, thinking, here we are again. The difference was what happened next. Instead of going silent for 2 days, I named the exact thing. I said, "When you say come on, I feel stupid for telling you the truth." He stood by the refrigerator with his arms crossed, and I watched the struggle on his face between pride and understanding. Finally, he said, not warmly but honestly, "I don't want to be the kind of man you can't tell the truth to." It was not an apology yet, it was a doorway. I stepped through it. I said, "Then don't argue with me about whether it hurt. Ask me why." He looked at the floor for a long second and then asked, "Why did it hurt?" I cried so fast it startled both of us. Not because the joke was so terrible, because he stayed. That may be the skill no one taught me. Staying in the room while meaning gets untangled. Not performing calm. Not winning the facts. Staying long enough for the real thing underneath to be named. In the house I grew up in, whoever got loud or whoever went silent controlled the ending. In my marriage, I repeated that same script with cleaner manners. Repair asked for something braver. It asked us to tell the truth without punishment. By spring, the house felt less brittle, even though we were still very much ourselves. Elise said one night, "You two talk different now." And she was right. We talked slower, clearer, and with fewer hidden knives in our voices. I did not know it then, but this was the work that would keep us from going cold. The deepest test came when my mother started failing. Her illness was long, not dramatic at first, just a steady loss that wore me down in spoonfuls. I drove to her town twice a week, managed medications, argued with doctors, and came home carrying that hospital smell in my coat. Daniel did what he had always done best under stress: practical care. He handled dinners. He kept laundry moving. He checked the tires on my car. Years earlier, I would have called that enough and swallowed the rest. By then, I knew I needed comfort too. One night after a rough day at rehab, I came home and found he had fixed the loose back step and made soup. I stood in the kitchen and burst into tears anyway. He came toward me and said, "Tell me what happened." Those words hit me like grace. I told him about my mother forgetting my name for a full minute, about the nurse who was gentle, about feeling 13 and 70 at the same time. He listened, not perfectly. He still interrupted once with a solution. But when I looked at him, he stopped and said, "Okay, keep going." That sentence might have been the kindest thing he gave me in middle age. A few days later, I failed him. He came home worried about layoffs after a merger, and I was so full of my mother's decline that I barely listened. He got quiet. The old Daniel would have gone to the garage and disappeared. Instead, he stood in the doorway and said, haltingly, I think you're doing the thing where I disappear. It was my own language handed back to me. I wanted to defend myself. I was exhausted. I had reasons. He was still right. So I repaired. I said, "You're right, I'm scared and distracted, and I dropped you. Start over." He sat down and told me about the merger, about men at work pretending not to panic, about being 50 and uncertain in a way he had never been. I held his hand while he talked. That was when I understood repair is not a women's skill or a men's skill. It is a humility skill. Whoever notices the break first has to be brave first. My mother died the next year. The day after the funeral, the house was full of cold food and wilted flowers. I stood at the sink in my black dress, unable to move, and Daniel put his hand on my back and said, "I know you miss her already." I folded over the counter and cried. He did not fix it. He stayed. Repair did not make grief smaller, but it kept me from being alone inside it. That changed what our marriage could carry. For the first time, endurance in our home had a pulse. I did not know it then, but this was the work that would keep us from going cold. I did not know it then, but this was the work that would keep us from going cold. By the time the children were grown, repair had become part of our marriage, though not a polished part. It was more like a handrail we used when we remembered and ignored when we were tired. Daniel still retreated when he felt criticized. I still sharpened my voice when I felt unseen. The difference was that we noticed the fall faster. Sometimes one of us could say, "We're doing it again," and that single sentence would save us a day of distance. Elise saw the change before we did. In her 20s, she called me one night after a fight with her husband, whispering from the bathroom so he would not hear. She said, "I don't know if we're in trouble or just bad at this." I stood in my kitchen holding the phone cord and heard my younger self in her voice. I told her what Ruth told me years earlier. Say what happened, say what hurt, say what you meant, then stop punishing each other. She got quiet and then said, "That sounds obvious." I said, "It is. It's also hard." A week later, she called back, laughing and crying. "It worked, but it felt stupid." I told her that was normal. Skills often feel fake before they feel natural. What matters is whether they bring you back. Daniel and I needed the reminder ourselves when he retired. I expected retirement to soften him. Instead, it unsettled him. He was home all day, restless, moving tools from shelf to shelf, and suddenly caring how I loaded the dishwasher after 40 years of not caring. I took it personally. He took my annoyance personally. We spent a month fighting about nonsense, tea, light bulbs, grocery lists, while the real problem stayed hidden. One evening after he reorganized my baking drawer, I finally said, "What happened is you keep managing me like a project. What hurts is I feel crowded in my own house. What I think you mean is you're trying to feel useful." He stared at me, then looked down at his hands and said, "That is what I mean. I don't know who I am here yet." There it was. The real argument hiding behind measuring cups. We talked for an hour, not gracefully. He got defensive twice. I cried once. We repaired twice inside the same conversation. In younger years, I would have called that failure. By then, I knew better. Repair is not one perfect apology. It is a series of returns, and those returns kept us from turning into polite roommates in old age. What I believed as a young wife was that love should run on instinct. What I understand now is that love without skill leaves too much to mood and luck. Repair was the relationship skill no one taught me, and learning it saved the second half of our life. I did not know it then, but this was the work that would keep us from going cold. I did not know it then, but this was the work that would keep us from going cold. Daniel had a mild stroke at 68, and with it came a fear I knew well that in crisis we would revert to our earliest selves. In hard moments, people often become the version of themselves they learned in childhood. I worried I would turn brisk and controlling. I worried he would disappear behind silence. Both of those things happened, just not for as long as they once would have. The stroke was small by medical standards and enormous by ours. I found him in the backyard confused and angry because his mouth would not shape words. In the emergency room, I signed forms, called the children, and held a paper cup of bad coffee so hard my hand cramped. Daniel kept trying to speak and getting frustrated. At one point, he snapped at me for correcting a date. The old me would have stored that moment like evidence. Instead, once he was stable and resting, I sat beside the bed and said quietly, "That scared me, and when you snapped, I felt pushed away." He opened his eyes and squeezed my fingers. He could barely talk, but he managed, "Scared. Sorry." Broken speech, but it was repair. I leaned over the bed rail and cried with relief. Recovery was slow and humbling. He hated needing help. I hated how resentment and devotion can live in the same hour. I would button his shirt and feel tender, then hear him criticize how I filled the pill box and want to leave the room. The difference was that now I named the break before it hardened. I'm helping you, and when you correct me like that, I feel invisible. Sometimes he apologized right away. Sometimes he got defensive and we had to try again an hour later, but we came back. Months into therapy, he told me something I had never heard in 40 years of marriage. He said, "My father only talked to us if something was wrong. I still hear correction as danger." I sat there with pill bottles and insurance papers spread across the table and felt the shape of his life all at once. Not an excuse, a map. Repair gave us maps of each other. By then, our grandchildren were old enough to notice how adults handled mistakes. One of them spilled juice at our house and burst into tears before anyone reacted. Elise started to scold, stopped herself, and said, "Okay, what happened?" I looked at Daniel and saw him smile. That is what I understand now. Repair changes more than a couple. It changes the emotional weather of a family. Children learn whether mistakes lead to shame or return. I learned that late, in a marriage I once called only steady. Late was still in time. That became one of the great comforts of my life. We had not changed the beginning of our story, but we had changed what came after it, and that mattered to everyone who came after us. I did not know it then, but this was the work that would keep us from going cold. I am 74 now, and Daniel has been gone 3 years. People ask what made our marriage last, and they expect me to say loyalty, faith, or hard work. Those belong in the answer. But if I tell the truth all the way through, the word I return to is repair. Not because we were naturally good at it, because we were not. And learning it changed everything after that. This morning I stood at my kitchen sink, the same posture I have carried through every season of my life, and watched the yard go silver with early light. The clock ticked softly. For a moment I was back in Ruth's kitchen with green beans in my lap, hearing the sentence I did not know would rescue me. We repaired it before bed. If I could speak to the younger woman I was, I would not tell her to choose a different husband. I would tell her to learn the skill sooner. I would tell her peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of return. I would tell her it's fine is not kindness when it buries the truth. Most marriages do not break in one loud moment. They thin out from unrepaired cuts. In our last years, Daniel and I still annoyed each other. He stacked bowls wrong. I interrupted when I was anxious. But we had a way back. Sometimes it was, let me start over. Sometimes it was, that came out harsher than I meant. Sometimes it was the plainest sentence in the world. I know you're not my enemy. Those are not glamorous lines. They are bridge lines. A life is built on more bridge lines than speeches. The relationship skill no one taught me turned out to be simple enough to memorize and hard enough to practice for a lifetime. Say what happened, say what hurt, say what you meant, ask what they meant. Stay in the room. Come back before pride hardens. I gave those words to my daughter. She gives them to her children in smaller forms. That is how families change. I do not romanticize our marriage. There were lonely years. There were years I felt unseen, and years he felt judged, and years we both mistook efficiency for intimacy. Repair did not erase any of that. It gave us a way to stop adding to it. It let tenderness grow in places that had been dry a long time. It made room for truth without punishment. When I rinse my cup now and set it by the rack, I still catch myself saying, sometimes out loud, that came out wrong. Let me try again. Maybe that is the final lesson. Repair is not only what I learned to do with a husband, it is the way I live with people now, and sometimes the way I live with myself. No one taught me young, but I learned anyway. At my age, that still feels like grace. And when younger women ask what matters most, that is the word I give them.